I was drinking my morning coffee on the back deck when I saw her for the first time, standing on my private dock with a clipboard in one hand and her phone in the other, directing a group of about 15 strangers onto a small tour boat like she owned the place. My name is Preston Vaughn, and I had just bought this waterfront property on the Potomac River in Alexandria, Virginia, 3 months prior. The house was a dream come true after years of saving and working myself to exhaustion as a project manager for a tech company. The location was perfect, with a sprawling yard that led down to the water and my own private dock where I kept my fishing boat. The HOA fees were steep, but the neighborhood was quiet and well-maintained, so I figured it was worth it. I was beginning to realize I had made a terrible mistake. The woman on my dock was wearing white capri pants and a coral-colored blouse that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was styled in that specific way that screamed expensive salon, and even from 50 yards away, I could see the enormous sunglasses perched on her head. She was gesturing animatedly at the water while the tourists, all clutching cameras and wearing fanny packs, nodded along. I set my coffee down and walked across the lawn toward the dock. As I got closer, I could hear her voice carrying across the morning air with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. And this dock here provides the perfect vantage point for viewing the historic waterfront, she was saying. You will notice the architectural details of the surrounding homes, which date back to the early 19th century in some cases. "Excuse me," I called out as I stepped onto the dock. The wood creaked under my feet, and everyone turned to look at me. "What's going on here?" The woman turned toward me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Up close, I could see she was probably in her late 40s, with the kind of tan skin that came from too much time by a pool and not enough sunscreen. Her makeup was applied with precision, but there was something cold about her expression. "Good morning," she said in a tone that suggested my interruption was both unexpected and unwelcome. "You must be the new owner. I am Brenda Montgomery, the HOA president. I sent you an email about the charter tours 2 weeks ago." I blinked at her. I never received any email about charter tours. And even if I had, this is my private dock. You cannot just bring people onto my property. Brenda's smile tightened. According to the HOA bylaws, all waterfront amenities within the community boundaries are subject to shared use for approved community activities. The charter tour business is a community-approved venture that helps fund neighborhood improvements. "Community approved by who?" I demanded. "And this is not a community amenity. This is my dock, attached to my property that I paid for." One of the tourists, an older gentleman wearing a Washington Nationals cap, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should go," he said quietly to his wife. "Nonsense," Brenda said firmly. She turned back to me with a look that could freeze boiling water. "Mr. Vaughn, is it? Perhaps you are not familiar with how things work in a managed community. The HOA has certain rights and privileges that supersede individual property claims when it comes to maintaining the aesthetic and financial health of the neighborhood. The charter tours generate revenue that goes directly into our community fund." "That's complete nonsense," I said, feeling my temper starting to rise. "You cannot use my property to run a business without my permission. I do not care what the HOA bylaws say. This is trespassing." Brenda's expression turned icy. "I suggest you review your purchase agreement more carefully, Mr. Vaughn. You will find that all residents agreed to comply with HOA regulations, which include accommodating approved community initiatives. Now, if you will excuse us, we have a schedule to maintain." She turned back to the group and started herding them toward the boat that was tied up at the end of my dock. I stood there in stunned disbelief as 15 strangers climbed aboard a vessel moored to my property, without a single word of apology or acknowledgement that this might be problematic. "This is not over," I called after her. Brenda did not even turn around. She just waved one hand dismissively over her shoulder as she followed the last tourist onto the boat. Within minutes, they had untied and were motoring out into the Potomac, leaving me standing alone on my dock with my blood pressure somewhere in the stratosphere. I stormed back to the house and immediately pulled up my email. Sure enough, there was nothing from Brenda Montgomery or the HOA about charter tours. I searched through my spam folder, my deleted items, everything. Nothing. Either she was lying or she had sent it to the wrong address. I pulled out the folder containing all my closing documents and started reading through the HOA bylaws. The document was 73 pages of dense legal language that seemed designed to be as confusing as possible. I spent 2 hours going through it with a highlighter, searching for anything about shared use of private property or community business ventures. There was a section about maintaining community standards and another about the HOA's right to access properties for inspection and maintenance purposes. There was even a bizarre clause about holiday decoration restrictions. But nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it say anything about the HOA being allowed to use my dock for commercial purposes. I called the HOA office number listed on their website. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Brenda's voice came through the speaker, cheerful and professional. "You have reached the Riverside Estates HOA office. Please leave a message and I will return your call within 2 business days. 2 business days. I hung up without leaving a message and decided to try a different approach. I pulled up the Virginia property law statutes online and started researching. It took me another hour, but I finally found what I was looking for. Virginia law was very clear that while HOAs had certain rights regarding common areas and shared amenities, they could not commandeer private property for commercial use without explicit written consent from the property owner. Armed with this information, I drafted an email to Brenda Montgomery with the HOA office address copied from the website. I kept it professional but firm, citing the specific statute and demanding that the charter tours cease using my dock immediately. I hit send and felt a small sense of satisfaction. That satisfaction lasted exactly 3 days, which was how long it took for Brenda to show up at my door again, this time with the tour group at 9 in the morning on a Saturday. I was still in my pajamas when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Brenda standing there with that same cold smile, holding her clipboard like a shield. "Good morning, Mr. Vaughn," she said. "I received your email. Unfortunately, your interpretation of the bylaws is incorrect. I have spoken with our HOA attorney, and he assures me that the charter tours are perfectly legal. Now, if you will excuse me, I have clients waiting." She gestured behind her, and I saw the tour group already making their way down my lawn toward the dock. I felt something snap inside me. "No," I said flatly. "I am calling the police." Brenda's eyes widened slightly. "That would be a very foolish decision, Mr. Vaughn. The police will simply tell you this is a civil matter. Meanwhile, you will be racking up fines for non-compliance with HOA regulations. Did you know that the penalty for interfering with approved community activities is $250 per incident?" "I do not care about your made-up fines," I said. "Get off my property or I am calling the cops right now." We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Brenda's smile returned, but there was no warmth in it whatsoever. "Fine," she said. "But you are making a very serious mistake. The HOA board will be hearing about this, and I can guarantee you will regret this decision." She turned and called out to the tour group, telling them there had been an unexpected change of plans and they would be using the community dock instead. I watched from my doorway as they trudged back up my lawn and down the street. Brenda shot me one final glare before following them. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding. I knew I had just made an enemy, but I could not let her walk all over me. This was my property, and I had every right to control who used it. The next morning, I found a letter from the HOA in my mailbox. It was a formal notice of violation, claiming I had disrupted an approved community activity and was being fined $250. The letter was signed by Brenda Montgomery and included instructions for paying the fine within 30 days. I took a picture of the letter and immediately called a real estate attorney whose number I found online. His name was Richard Chen, and his receptionist scheduled me for a consultation the following Tuesday. In the meantime, I decided to do some investigating. I walked down to the community dock that Brenda had mentioned, which was located about half a mile south of my property. It was a public access point maintained by the HOA, with a small parking area and a weathered wooden dock that extended about 20 feet into the water. What I saw there made my blood run cold. There was a large sign posted at the entrance that read, "Riverside Historical Tours departing daily at 9 a.m. and 2 p.m. $45 per person." Below that was a phone number and a website address. I pulled out my phone and navigated to the website. It was professionally designed, with glossy photos of the Potomac River and the surrounding historic homes. The homepage featured a smiling photo of Brenda Montgomery with a bio describing her as the founder and lead tour guide of Riverside Historical Tours. According to the site, she had been running the business for 2 years and had given tours to over 3,000 visitors. I scrolled through the website, my anger growing with each click. There were testimonials from satisfied customers, a photo gallery, and even a booking system where people could purchase tickets online. The prices ranged from $45 for a basic tour to $95 for a premium sunset experience. This was not some small community fundraiser. This was a full-blown commercial enterprise, and Brenda had been using HOA resources and apparently trying to use my private property to run it. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself. Then, I called the number listed on the website. A cheerful recorded message answered, featuring Brenda's voice welcoming me to Riverside Historical Tours and providing instructions for booking. I hung up and stood there on the community dock, watching a pair of kayakers paddle past. The morning sun was reflecting off the water, and it should have been peaceful. Instead, I felt like I was standing in the middle of a minefield. My consultation with Richard Chen was eye-opening. He was a sharp-looking man in his mid-30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor. I showed him all the documentation I had gathered, including the HOA bylaws, Brenda's fine, and the screenshots from the tour website. He listened carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This is problematic on several levels," he said. "First, the HOA absolutely cannot use your private dock for commercial purposes without your written consent. That is clear-cut under Virginia property law. Second, if Miss Montgomery is running a for-profit business and claiming it is an HOA community activity, that is potentially fraudulent. HOAs are typically structured as non-profit organizations, and any revenue generated should go directly into the community fund, not into someone's personal bank account." "So what can I do?" I asked. "Well, you have several options," Richard said. You can file a formal complaint with the HOA board, though given that Miss Montgomery is the president, I am not sure how effective that would be. You can file a civil suit against both Miss Montgomery and the HOA for trespass and harassment, or you can report this to the appropriate authorities and let them investigate. What authorities? I asked. If she is operating a commercial charter business, she needs various permits and licenses. The Coast Guard regulates commercial maritime activities. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries has jurisdiction over boat operations. And if she is collecting money and not properly reporting it for tax purposes, the IRS would be very interested. I felt a surge of hope. Can you help me file complaints with these agencies? I can, Richard said. But I want you to understand that this could get messy. Miss Montgomery clearly has some level of power in your community, and she does not strike me as someone who will back down easily. Are you prepared for a fight? I thought about it for a moment. I could back down, pay the ridiculous fine, and let Brenda continue using my property however she wanted, or I could stand my ground and deal with whatever consequences came my way. I am prepared, I said. Richard nodded. Good. Let me draft some letters and we will start the process. In the meantime, I want you to document everything. If she comes onto your property again, take photos and videos. Keep records of any communication, and do not pay that fine. Paying it could be interpreted as an admission that you violated the HOA rules. I left his office feeling better than I had in days. I had a plan and professional help. Brenda Montgomery might have thought she could bully me into submission, but she had picked the wrong person to mess with. Over the next week, Richard sent formal letters to the Coast Guard, the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, and the IRS, outlining the situation and requesting investigations. He also sent a cease and desist letter to Brenda, informing her that any further use of my property would result in immediate legal action. The response was swift and brutal. 2 days after the letters were sent, I received another notice from the HOA. This time, I was being fined for failure to maintain property standards. According to the notice, my lawn was not being mowed to the required height, my trash cans were visible from the street, and I had failed to submit my house paint color for approval before moving in. Every single claim was absurd. My lawn was perfectly maintained by a professional service I had hired. My trash cans were in my garage except on pickup days, and I had not painted anything because the house was already painted when I bought it. I forwarded the notice to Richard, who assured me it was retaliation and would not hold up if challenged. But it was clear that Brenda was not going to make this easy. The following Sunday, I was sitting on my back deck reading when I heard voices. I looked up and saw Brenda leading another tour group down my lawn toward the dock. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I walked toward them. Miss Montgomery, you were sent a cease and desist letter. You are trespassing on my property. Brenda turned to me with that same cold smile. Mr. Vaughn, I explained this to you already. The HOA has the right to access this dock for community purposes. Your attorney's letter has no legal standing. Then you will not mind if I call the police, I said, keeping my phone trained on her. Go ahead, Brenda said. I will be happy to explain the situation to them. I called 911 and reported a trespassing incident. The dispatcher said they would send an officer. I stayed on the dock, filming as Brenda continued her tour spiel about the historic waterfront, completely ignoring my presence. The police officer arrived about 15 minutes later. He was a young guy, probably in his late 20s, with a patient expression that suggested he had dealt with neighborhood disputes before. I explained the situation while Brenda stood nearby with her arms crossed, occasionally interjecting with comments about HOA rights and community standards. The officer listened to both of us, then asked to see the property line markers. I walked him around the perimeter of my yard, showing him the survey stakes that had been placed during the closing process. The dock was clearly within my property boundaries. "Madam," the officer said to Brenda, "if this dock is on his private property, you need his permission to be here. The HOA having rights to common areas does not extend to commandeering someone's private dock." "This is ridiculous," Brenda snapped. "The HOA has been using waterfront access points throughout this community for years. He does not get to just opt out because he is too selfish to support community activities." "That is not how property law works," the officer said firmly. "I am going to have to ask you and your group to leave." Brenda's face turned red. "This is harassment. I am going to file a complaint against this officer and against Mr. Vaughn. The HOA will not tolerate this kind of obstructionist behavior." "You are free to file whatever complaints you like, madam," the officer said. "But right now, you need to leave this property." The tour group, looking thoroughly uncomfortable, began making their way back up the lawn. Brenda followed, but not before stopping in front of me. "You have made a very powerful enemy, Mr. Vaughn," she said quietly. "I hope you are ready for the consequences." She walked away before I could respond. The police officer gave me an incident report number and suggested I might want to consider installing cameras or no trespassing signs. I thanked him and went back into the house. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline. This was escalating faster than I had anticipated, and I was starting to wonder if I had bitten off more than I could chew. That night, I installed 2 security cameras covering the dock and backyard. They were connected to my phone, so I would get an alert anytime there was motion detected. I also called a sign company and ordered a large private property no trespassing sign to post at the entrance to the dock. Richard called me the next morning with news. "The Coast Guard is taking your complaint seriously," he said. "They are sending an inspector to investigate weather miss. Montgomery has the proper permits and licenses for operating a charter boat business." "That is great," I said. "When?" "Sometime in the next 2 weeks. They would not give me an exact date. But they did say that operating an uninspected passenger vessel or carrying passengers for hire without proper certification can result in significant fines and penalties." "Good," I said. "Maybe that will finally get through to her." "I hope so," Richard said. "But Preston, I want you to be careful. People like this do not respond well to being challenged. Keep your cameras running and do not engage with her if you can help it." I promised I would be careful and hung up. The rest of the day passed quietly, and I started to hope that maybe Brenda had finally gotten the message. That hope died the following Tuesday morning when I checked my email and found a notice that the HOA was holding an emergency board meeting to discuss the Preston Vaughn situation. The meeting was scheduled for that evening at 7 o'clock at the community center, and my attendance was strongly encouraged. I called Richard, who said he could not make it on such short notice but advised me to attend and take detailed notes. "Do not let them intimidate you," he said. "You have not done anything wrong." I showed up at the community center at 6:55. The building was a modest brick structure near the neighborhood entrance, with a parking lot that was already half full. I walked inside and found the meeting room, where about 20 people were seated in folding chairs facing a long table at the front. Brenda was sitting in the center chair, flanked by 4 other board members. She saw me enter, and her expression hardened. The other board members were a mixed group, ranging from a stern-looking woman in her 60s to a younger guy who kept checking his phone. I took a seat in the back row. The other residents eyed me with curiosity and what might have been sympathy. Brenda called the meeting to order at exactly 7 o'clock. She went through some preliminary business about landscaping budgets and upcoming neighborhood events, speaking in a crisp, professional tone. Then she moved on to what was clearly the main event. Item 4 on tonight's agenda concerns a situation that has arisen with one of our newer residents, Brenda said, looking directly at me. Mr. Preston Vaughn has been interfering with an approved HOA community activity and has shown a pattern of non-compliance with our neighborhood standards. I raised my hand. I would like to respond to that. You will have an opportunity to speak when I am finished, Brenda said coldly. As I was saying, Mr. Vaughn has refused to allow the HOA to use his dock for the historical tours that have been a beloved community tradition for the past 2 years. He has called the police on me and other board members, and he has threatened legal action against the HOA. Furthermore, he has accumulated several violations for property maintenance issues. One of the other board members, the older woman, spoke up. What exactly is the nature of these historical tours? They are educational excursions that I lead personally, Brenda said. They showcase the rich history of our waterfront community and the Potomac River area. All proceeds go directly into the community fund for neighborhood improvements. That was an outright lie, and I could not stay quiet anymore. That is not true, I said, standing up. Miss Montgomery runs a for-profit business called Riverside Historical Tours. She charges $45 per person and has been doing this commercially for 2 years. None of that money goes to the HOA. The room erupted in murmurs. Brenda's face flushed. That is a slanderous accusation, Mr. Vaughn. I have documentation proving that all tour revenue is deposited into the HOA account. Then I am sure you would not mind showing that documentation to everyone here, I said. Because I have screenshots from your business website showing the pricing and describing you as the owner and founder. I pulled out my phone and held up the screenshots I had saved. Several people in the audience leaned forward to look. The younger board member, who had been mostly silent until now, spoke up. Brenda, I think we need to see those financial records. If there is any question about where the money is going, we need to clear it up. This is not the time or place for an audit, Brenda said sharply. We are here to discuss Mr. Vaughn's violations. Actually, I think this is exactly the time and place, said a man in the front row. He turned to look at me. Do you have proof that she is running this as a commercial business? I have her website, business registration documents from the Virginia State Corporation Commission, and testimony from customers who paid her directly, I said. My attorney has already filed complaints with the Coast Guard and other regulatory agencies. The room exploded into arguments. Some people were defending Brenda, saying she had always been a dedicated board president. Others were demanding answers about where the tour money had gone. The other board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Brenda banged a gavel on the table. This meeting is getting out of hand. I am calling for a vote on whether to assess additional fines against Mr. Vaughn for his continued non-compliance. I call for a vote of no confidence in the board president, someone shouted from the back. I turned to see it was an older gentleman who lived 3 houses down from me. I had met him once while walking my neighbor's dog. That is out of order, Brenda snapped. No, it is not, the older woman on the board said. She turned to Brenda with a hard expression. Margaret is right to call for this. If there are questions about financial impropriety, we need to address them before we can move forward with any other business. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but the other 3 board members were nodding in agreement. She sat back in her chair, her jaw clenched. Fine, she said. We will table the discussion about Mr. Vaughn's violations until the financial questions are resolved. This meeting is adjourned. She stood up and walked out of the room without another word. I watched her go, feeling both vindicated and anxious. I had just made things much worse, but I had also exposed what was really going on. Several residents came up to talk to me after the meeting. Most of them were supportive, saying they had always thought something was off about the tours but had never questioned it. A few were hostile, accusing me of trying to destroy the neighborhood over a petty dispute. I drove home exhausted but feeling like maybe, just maybe, I was starting to make progress. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with motion alerts from the security cameras. I grabbed it and pulled up the app, expecting to see Brenda and another tour group. Instead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Someone had spray-painted "Community Trader" across my dock in large red letters. I jumped out of bed and ran outside. The paint was still wet, dripping down the wood planks into the water. The morning sun made it look like blood. I immediately called the police and filed a vandalism report. The same officer from before came out to take photos and collect a statement. He looked genuinely sympathetic this time. "This is getting out of hand," he said. "Have you considered getting a restraining order against Miss Montgomery?" "I do not have proof she did this," I said. "No, but there is a clear pattern of harassment. Talk to your attorney about it." I promised I would and spent the rest of the morning trying to clean the paint off my dock. It had soaked into the wood, and even after an hour of scrubbing, faint red stains remained. Richard called me that afternoon. "I heard about the vandalism. I am filing for a restraining order today." "We have enough evidence of harassment to get a temporary order at least." "Thank you," I said. "This is getting insane." "I know, but hang in there. The Coast Guard inspection is happening tomorrow." That perked me up. "Really? How do you know?" They called me for more information about Miss Montgomery's operation. "They are sending someone out to inspect her vessel and verify her permits." I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this nightmare was finally going to end. The next day, I worked from home, keeping one eye on my computer and the other on the view of the water. Around 2 in the afternoon, I saw a Coast Guard vessel approaching the community dock. I grabbed my binoculars and watched as 2 uniformed officers climbed out and walked toward Brenda's tour boat, which was tied up at the dock. Brenda appeared a few minutes later, clearly agitated, gesturing wildly as she spoke to them. The inspection lasted about 45 minutes. I could see the officers examining the boat, checking equipment and taking notes. Brenda's body language became increasingly defensive as the inspection continued. Finally, one of the officers handed her what looked like a document. Even from a distance, I could see her face turn red. She started arguing, but the officer just shook his head and walked back to the Coast Guard vessel. I waited impatiently for Richard to call with an update. It came around 4 o'clock. "You are not going to believe this," Richard said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Miss Montgomery was operating without any of the required permits. No passenger vessel inspection, no captain's license for commercial operations, no certificate of inspection from the Coast Guard. Nothing. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means the Coast Guard just slapped her with a $10,000 fine and an order to cease all commercial operations immediately. If she tries to run another tour, she could face criminal charges." I sat down heavily in my chair. $10,000. Yep. The Coast Guard does not mess around when it comes to uninspected passenger vessels. People can get hurt or killed if boats are not properly maintained and operated. She is lucky they did not seize the vessel. "Oh my God," I said. "She is going to lose her mind." "Probably," Richard agreed. "Which is why I got you that restraining order. It was approved this morning. Miss Montgomery is not allowed to come within 100 feet of you or your property. I am having the sheriff serve her with the papers this afternoon." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Thank you, Richard. Seriously, thank you. You are welcome. But Preston, be careful. She still has some power as HOA president and she is going to be looking for revenge. Document everything and call the police if she violates the restraining order. I promised I would and hung up. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. That evening, I was grilling dinner on the back deck when I saw flashing lights in front of my house. I walked around to the front yard and saw a sheriff's deputy's car parked in Brenda's driveway across the street. I had not realized until that moment that she actually lived in the same neighborhood. The deputy was standing at her door, papers in hand. I could not hear what was being said, but I saw Brenda snatch the papers from him and then slam the door. The deputy walked back to his car, shaking his head. As he drove away, I felt Brenda's eyes on me. I looked across the street and saw her standing in her front window, staring at me with an expression of pure hatred. I held her gaze for a moment, then turned and walked back to my backyard. I was not going to be intimidated anymore. The next few days were blissfully quiet. No tour groups, no harassment, no violations notices. I started to hope that maybe the Coast Guard fine and the restraining order had finally knocked some sense into Brenda. Then I got a call from Richard. "We have got a problem," he said. My heart sank. "What now?" "The HOA is suing you for defamation and interference with business operations. They are claiming that your complaints to the Coast Guard and other agencies were malicious and caused significant financial harm to the community." "That is insane," I said. "How can they sue me for reporting illegal activity?" "They can file whatever lawsuit they want," Richard said. "Whether it will hold up in court is another matter. This is clearly a SLAPP suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. It is designed to intimidate you and drain your resources fighting it. Can we get it dismissed? We can file a motion to dismiss, yes. Virginia has anti-SLAPP statutes that should protect you. But it is going to take time and money." I rubbed my face tiredly. "How much money?" "Probably $5,000 to $10,000 in legal fees to fight it properly. Maybe more if it goes all the way to trial, though I doubt it will get that far." I wanted to scream. This was supposed to be my dream house, my peaceful waterfront retreat. Instead, it had turned into an expensive nightmare. "Do it," I said. "File the motion to dismiss. I am not backing down." "Good man," Richard said. "I will get started on it today." After I hung up, I sat on my couch staring at the wall. I was running out of money and patience. The legal fees were adding up, and even though I was in the right, the process was taking its toll. I decided to take a different approach. I started reaching out to other residents in the neighborhood, the ones who had seemed sympathetic at the board meeting. I invited them over for coffee or beer, just casual conversations to get to know my neighbors and hear their thoughts about the HOA. What I discovered was eye-opening. Brenda had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for almost 5 years. She made unilateral decisions, rarely consulted the other board members, and used HOA funds for questionable purposes. The tour business was just the tip of the iceberg. One neighbor, a retired accountant named George, told me that he had tried to review the HOA financial records the previous year and had been stonewalled at every turn. Another neighbor, a woman named Patricia who worked as a paralegal, said Brenda had threatened her with fines when she questioned a decision to hire Brenda's brother-in-law's company for landscaping work at inflated prices. I started documenting all of this, building a case not just against Brenda's harassment of me, but against her mismanagement of the entire HOA. 2 weeks later, there was another HOA board meeting. This time, it was packed. Word had spread about the Coast Guard fine and the lawsuit, and people wanted answers. I arrived early and took a seat in the front row. Brenda came in a few minutes later, flanked by her attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit. She did not look at me. The meeting started with Brenda trying to maintain control, but it quickly devolved into chaos. Residents stood up one after another, demanding to see financial records, questioning the lawsuit against me, and asking about the tour business. Brenda tried to shut down the questions, but George stood up and made a formal motion to conduct an independent audit of the HOA finances. The motion was seconded immediately. "That is out of order," Brenda's attorney said. "The board has not approved placing that motion on the agenda." Under the HOA bylaws, any resident can make a motion from the floor if it is seconded by at least 3 other residents, Patricia said, standing up. She had clearly done her homework. "I see at least a dozen hands up. We are calling for a vote." Brenda looked like she wanted to argue, but even her attorney seemed to realize they were outnumbered. The vote was held and the motion passed overwhelmingly. An independent auditor would review the HOA books going back 3 years, but the residents were not done. Another motion was made to suspend Brenda from her duties as president pending the results of the audit. That motion passed too. Brenda stood up, her face white with rage. "This is a witch hunt," she said, her voice shaking. "I have dedicated 5 years of my life to this community, and this is how you repay me. By listening to lies from some newcomer who does not even understand how HOAs work." "This is not about him," George said firmly. "This is about accountability and transparency. If the audit shows everything is in order, you will be reinstated. But given the serious questions that have been raised, we need to know the truth." Brenda grabbed her purse and stormed out, her attorney hurrying after her. The meeting continued without her, with the other board members voting to appoint an interim president and setting a timeline for the audit. I left the meeting feeling hopeful, but also nervous. I had just helped orchestrate what amounted to a coup, and I knew Brenda would not go down without a fight. I was right to be nervous. 2 days later, I received a letter from Brenda's attorney threatening to add me as a defendant in a separate lawsuit for intentional interference with contract and conspiracy to defame. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear: back off or face even more legal consequences. I forwarded it to Richard, who called me within an hour. "This is harassment, plain and simple," he said. "They are trying to scare you into dropping everything. Do not fall for it." "I am not planning to," I said, "but I am getting worried about how much this is costing me." "I understand. Let me talk to some of the other residents who are concerned about this. If we can get a group together, we might be able to share the legal costs." That turned out to be easier than expected. Within a week, George and Patricia had organized a group of 15 homeowners who were willing to contribute to a legal defense fund. We pooled our resources and hired Richard to represent all of us in dealing with Brenda and her attorneys. The audit results came back 3 weeks later, and they were damning. The independent auditor found that over $70,000 in HOA funds were unaccounted for over the past 3 years. There were payments to vendors that did not exist, reimbursements for expenses that were never properly documented, and clear evidence that tour revenue had been deposited into Brenda's personal account rather than the HOA fund. The auditor's report was presented at an emergency board meeting. I was there, along with most of the neighborhood. The interim president, a sensible woman named Linda who worked as a CPA, read through the findings in a grim voice. When she finished, there was stunned silence. Then someone asked the question everyone was thinking: should we call the police? Linda nodded slowly. "Yes, I think we have to. This appears to be embezzlement and fraud. We have a fiduciary duty to the homeowners to pursue this." The motion was made and passed unanimously. The Alexandria Police Department was contacted, and a detective was assigned to the case. I watched as the neighborhood turned against Brenda completely. People who had defended her just weeks earlier were now furious, talking about how they had trusted her and she had betrayed them. The consensus was clear. Brenda Montgomery needed to face consequences for what she had done. The detective, a thorough woman named Detective Sarah Williams, interviewed dozens of residents over the following weeks. She subpoenaed bank records, reviewed the audit findings, and built a case. During this time, Brenda's attorneys quietly dropped the lawsuit against me and the HOA. I think they realized that their client was facing much bigger problems than a property dispute. Brenda herself seemed to disappear. Her house was dark most nights, and I rarely saw her car in the driveway. Rumors circulated that she was trying to sell her house and flee before charges were filed. She did not get the chance. On a Tuesday morning in late May, I was drinking coffee on my back deck when I saw police cars pull up to Brenda's house. Detective Williams and two uniformed officers walked to her door and knocked. I could not hear what was said, but I saw Brenda come outside in a bathrobe. There was a brief conversation, and then one of the officers put handcuffs on her wrists. She was arrested right there in her driveway while half the neighborhood watched. I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, vindication, but also sadness. This did not have to happen. If Brenda had just respected basic boundaries and operated honestly, none of this would have occurred. Brenda was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and operating an illegal commercial enterprise. The Coast Guard charges stood as well, with her $10,000 fine still outstanding. The Virginia Attorney General's office got involved because of the HOA fraud, and additional charges were filed related to violations of state nonprofit regulations. Her trial took place 8 months later. I was called as a witness to testify about the tour operations and how she had used my property without permission. The trial lasted 3 days, and the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her crimes. Brenda's defense argued that she had been confused about the rules and that any financial irregularities were honest mistakes. The jury did not buy it. She was convicted on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. He noted that Brenda had held a position of trust in the community and had abused it systematically for personal gain. He sentenced her to 3 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus additional fines. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, Brenda finally looked at me. There was no hatred in her eyes anymore, just defeat and exhaustion. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, just a weary sense that justice had been done. The HOA held elections for a new board, and Linda was elected president. One of her first acts was to formally apologize to me for everything that had happened, and to assure me that my property rights would be respected going forward. The community dock was still used for boat access, but only by residents and only for personal use. No more commercial tours, no more unauthorized use of private property. I finally got to enjoy the waterfront property I had bought. I spent summer evenings fishing from my dock, invited friends over for barbecues, and even bought a better boat. The neighborhood slowly healed from the scandal, with new leadership bringing transparency and accountability to the HOA. Richard and I stayed in touch. He helped the HOA recover as much of the embezzled money as possible, though we all knew we would never get it all back. Brenda's assets were seized and sold, but she had spent much of the money on personal luxuries that were long gone. George and Patricia became good friends. We started a neighborhood watch program to ensure something like this never happened again. We instituted proper oversight mechanisms for the HOA board, including mandatory annual audits and term limits for officers. The Coast Guard fine was never paid. Brenda declared bankruptcy from prison, and the government eventually wrote it off. Her tour boat was seized and sold at auction. I heard it went to a legitimate charter company in Annapolis that actually had all the proper permits and licenses. About a year after Brenda's sentencing, I was sitting on my dock watching the sunset when Patricia walked down to join me. She had brought 2 beers and we sat in comfortable silence for a while. "You know, a lot of people in the neighborhood say you are a hero," she said finally. I shook my head. "I am not a hero. I just did not want someone using my property without permission." "Maybe," Patricia said. "But you stood up when a lot of people would have just paid the fine and moved on. You exposed corruption that was hurting all of us. That matters." I thought about that for a while. I guess I just believe in property rights and basic fairness. Brenda could have run a legitimate tour business. She could have used the community dock with permission and operated legally. But she chose to cut corners and take advantage of people. That was her choice. "And she paid the price for it," Patricia said. We finished our beers as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Potomac in shades of orange and gold. My dock, my property, my peace of mind. It had taken a fight to get here, but it was worth it. The HOA sent out a newsletter a few months later detailing all the reforms that had been implemented. There were new financial controls, regular audits, and a whistleblower policy to encourage residents to report concerns without fear of retaliation. The newsletter featured a quote from Linda: "Trust but verify. That is how we will ensure our community stays strong and honest." I framed that newsletter and hung it in my home office as a reminder that standing up for what is right is not always easy, but it is necessary. A reminder that unchecked power leads to corruption. And a reminder that a community is only as strong as its willingness to hold its leaders accountable. Brenda served 2 years of her 3-year sentence before being released on parole. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to North Carolina to live with relatives. I never saw her again. Her house sold to a young couple with 2 kids. They were lovely neighbors who respected boundaries and contributed positively to the community. It was like the Brenda era had been erased, though those of us who lived through it would never forget. The lawsuit threats, the vandalism, the harassment, all of it faded into memory. What remained was a lesson about standing your ground and fighting for your rights, even when it seems like the system is stacked against you. I continued to love my waterfront property. On quiet mornings, I would take my coffee out to the dock and watch the river wake up. Boats would drift past, birds would call from the trees, and I would feel grateful for the peace I had fought so hard to protect. The neighborhood became stronger after the scandal. People were more engaged with HOA business, attending meetings and asking questions. The new board was transparent and collaborative, seeking input before making major decisions. It was not perfect, but it was so much better than what had come before. George and I started taking fishing trips together. He taught me about the best spots on the Potomac and the right techniques for catching different species. Patricia and her husband would sometimes join us for dinner, and we would laugh about how bizarre that whole period had been. "Remember when she spray-painted your dock?" George said one evening, shaking his head. "I still cannot believe she thought she would get away with all of it." "Arrogance," Patricia said. "She thought the rules did not apply to her. She thought being HOA president made her untouchable." "That is the problem with petty power," I said. "It can corrupt just as thoroughly as the big stuff. Maybe more, because people do not take it as seriously." We all agreed on that point. The Brenda situation had taught us all valuable lessons about governance, accountability, and the importance of speaking up when something is wrong. The community fund that Brenda had embezzled from was eventually replenished through a combination of recovered assets and special assessments. It was not ideal, but residents understood it was necessary to get the HOA back on solid financial footing. Linda and the new board managed the process transparently, showing exactly where every dollar went and why. I got more involved in community activities after that. I joined the Architectural Review Committee and helped update the guidelines to be clearer and more reasonable. We eliminated some of the petty restrictions that Brenda had implemented, like the ridiculous rules about trash, convisibility, and lawn height that she had used as weapons against people she did not like. The process taught me that HOAs could actually be positive forces in a community when run properly. They could maintain property values, fund shared amenities, and create a sense of neighborhood identity. The problem was never the concept of an HOA. It was people like Brenda who abused their authority for personal gain. 2 years after Brenda's conviction, I was elected to the HOA board myself. I had not planned to run, but several neighbors encouraged me, saying my experience fighting corruption made me exactly the kind of person they wanted in leadership. I agreed to serve 1 term, with the understanding that I would focus on maintaining the reforms we had implemented and ensuring transparency remained the standard. It was harder work than I expected. There were disputes to mediate, budgets to balance, and endless small decisions that somehow always seemed to make someone angry. But I approached it with the same principle that had guided me through the Brenda situation. Treat people fairly, follow the rules, and be transparent about everything. My dock remained private, used only by me and the occasional friend I invited over. No tour groups, no unauthorized visitors, no drama. Just a peaceful spot to fish and think and enjoy the river. Sometimes I would sit there and reflect on how differently things could have gone. If I had just given in and let Brenda use my dock, I would have avoided all the stress and legal fees. But I also would have enabled her criminal behavior to continue. More money would have been embezzled, more residents would have been bullied and threatened, and eventually someone else would have been the target of her wrath. By standing up when I did, I had not only protected my own rights, but had inadvertently exposed a much larger problem. That felt good, even though the process had been exhausting and expensive. Richard and I remained friends as well. He ended up representing several other clients in HOA disputes, using the lessons learned from my case to help others fight back against overreach and corruption. He told me once that my case had reinvigorated his passion for law, reminding him why he became an attorney in the first place. The Coast Guard situation became something of a legend in the neighborhood. People would point out where Brenda's boat used to dock and tell the story of the $10,000 fine to new residents. It served as a cautionary tale about the importance of following regulations and operating businesses legitimately. I heard from Detective Williams occasionally. She moved on to other cases, but she told me that the Brenda investigation had been one of the most satisfying of her career because of how clear-cut the evidence was and how much it mattered to the community. She appreciated that residents had been willing to come forward and cooperate with the investigation, even when it was uncomfortable. The legal bills finally stopped coming about 3 years after the whole thing started. Between the motion to dismiss the SLAPP suit, the restraining order, the witness testimony, and all the consultations, I had spent close to $15,000 on attorney's fees. It was a huge amount of money, but I never regretted it. Some things are worth fighting for. My relationship with the HOA normalized completely under Linda's leadership. We disagreed on things occasionally, as neighbors do, but it was always respectful and handled through proper channels. No more threats, no more arbitrary fines, no more harassment, just normal community governance. I eventually expanded my dock, adding a section with a boat lift and a covered area for storing equipment. The Architectural Review Committee approved it quickly, with clear written standards and no hint of the arbitrary decision-making that had characterized Brenda's regime. The neighborhood property values recovered and even increased after the scandal was resolved. Potential buyers were initially scared off by the news coverage of the embezzlement and arrests. But as word spread about the reforms and new leadership, people started seeing it as a community that had cleaned house and come out stronger. I refinanced my mortgage around that time, and the appraiser told me my house had appreciated by almost 20% since I bought it. Part of that was the general real estate market, but part of it was also the increased confidence in the neighborhood's governance and stability. Looking back now, I can see how every decision point in the conflict mattered. If I had not documented everything with photos and videos, I would not have had evidence for court. If I had not consulted an attorney early, I might have paid those bogus fines and inadvertently admitted guilt. If I had not reached out to other neighbors and built a coalition, Brenda might have been able to isolate and intimidate me into backing down. But I also got lucky in some ways. I had the financial resources to hire a good attorney. I had supportive neighbors who were willing to stand up with me. I had a detective who took the case seriously, and a prosecutor who pursued charges aggressively. Not everyone in a similar situation would have those advantages. That realization led me to become more involved in advocating for HOA reform at the state level. I connected with other Virginia residents who had faced similar problems with abusive HOA boards, and we formed a coalition pushing for stronger oversight and clearer protections for homeowner rights. We successfully lobbied for legislation requiring all Virginia HOAs to conduct annual independent audits and making it easier for residents to access financial records. We also pushed for clearer rules about what HOAs could and could not regulate on private property. The laws were not perfect, but they were a step in the right direction. Brenda's case was actually cited in some of the legislative debates as an example of what could go wrong without proper oversight. Her story became a cautionary tale that helped convince lawmakers to take the issue seriously. I thought about reaching out to Brenda after she was released from prison, maybe to offer some sort of closure or understanding, but I ultimately decided against it. Some bridges are burned for good reason, and trying to rebuild them serves no purpose. She had made her choices and faced the consequences. That was enough. Instead, I focused on building positive relationships with my neighbors and contributing to the community in constructive ways. I hosted a neighborhood barbecue every 4th of July, volunteered for the community garden committee, and helped organize an annual river cleanup day. The dock that had been the center of so much conflict became a gathering place for good things. I taught neighborhood kids how to fish, let friends use it for small family gatherings, and even allowed the local high school crew team to use it as a practice dock with proper permission and insurance. That was the irony of the whole situation. I had never been opposed to sharing my property or contributing to the community. I had been opposed to someone taking what was mine without asking and using it for illegal purposes. If Brenda had just approached me honestly and requested permission, we might have worked something out. But honesty had never been her strong suit, and that had been her downfall. 5 years after I bought the house, I stood on my dock watching another beautiful sunset over the Potomac. The river was calm, reflecting the pink and orange sky like glass. A blue heron stood in the shallows nearby, hunting for fish. I thought about everything that had happened and everything I had learned, about standing up for yourself even when it is hard, about the importance of community and accountability, about how corruption can happen anywhere, even in something as mundane as a neighborhood HOA, and about how regular people, when they work together, can make things right. The dock creaked gently beneath my feet, solid and stable. My dock on my property, used in the way I chose. It had been worth the fight. A boat drifted past and the people on board waved. I waved back, smiling. This was what I had wanted when I bought this house: peace, community, and a place to call home. It had taken longer and been harder than expected, but I had finally gotten there. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I took a deep breath of the river air and felt grateful. Grateful for the property, grateful for the community, grateful for the lessons learned and the battles won. Inside the house, my phone buzzed with a message from George asking if I wanted to go fishing tomorrow morning. I texted back yes, smiling to myself. Life was good. The Brenda situation would always be part of my history with this house and this neighborhood, but it was no longer the defining story. That chapter had closed, and new, better chapters were being written every day. I took one last look at the river, then headed inside to plan the next day's fishing trip. The dock would be there in the morning, peaceful and private, exactly as it should be, and that was all I had ever wanted.